Hi there, this is Reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Chapter 5, Part 1. So Chapter 5 is a long chapter, and there are some important topics to address in this chapter, so I'm going to break it up into two parts, especially since I want to put some real effort into the second part of this chapter that concerns Chris's challenges and his relationship with his father, and that will be addressed in Part 2. So chapter 5 begins with them leaving the prairie and entering the high plains. Chris is starting to show some signs of impatience, which bothers or distresses the narrator. The flatness of the prairie disappears, and a deep undulation of the earth begins. Fences are rare, and the greenness has become paler, all signs that we approach the high plains. Again, there's another account of the actual in-the-world sense of being on a motorcycle, which is often terrifying. The road south is awful, choppy, narrow, bumpy concrete with a bad headwind going into the sun and big semis going the other way. These roller coaster hills speed them up on the downside and slow them up on the upside and prevent our seeing very far ahead, making passing nerve-wracking. Well, that does sound nerve-wracking, and semis are nerve-wracking, and I think the thing I'm most fearful of on the highway is a semi behind me on a bridge going downhill. That is my idea of hell. At Herod, John disappears for a drink. Now, it's funny, there's a tendency for them to stop and have beers in the middle of the day or drinks, and sometimes John goes off and has a shot. They don't get drunk or anything, but it's still kind of, if you just consider that last section I read about that nerve-wracking ride, the last thing I'd want to do in that situation is have any alcohol inside of me. Okay, so John disappears for a drink while Sylvia and Chris and I find some shade in a park and try to rest. It isn't restful. A change has taken place, and I don't quite know what it is. The streets of this town are broad, much broader than they need to be, and there is a pallor of dust in the air. Empty lots here and there between buildings have weeds growing in them. The sheet metal equipment sheds and the water tower are like those of previous towns, but more spread out. Everything is more run down and mechanical looking and sort of randomly located. Gradually I see what it is. Nobody is concerned anymore about tidily conserving space. The land isn't valuable anymore. We are in a western town. I would be inclined to make a comparison between then and now, but we do have vast swaths of the country that aren't considered valuable anymore. They may have shifted slightly, but that still is a thing. And I love though this observation coming up next. It's rare and difficult, especially that is more so now, to see any area which has not been somehow tainted by man. So when you see it, it can be eerie if you're not used to it. So no wonder they're not really feeling all that restful until you realize that you are in, let's just say kind of virgin land. And we are used to seeing empty areas. When we see empty areas, we're used to them being abandoned, not virginal. If it were abandoned land, there would be a chewed-up, scruffy look with chunks of old foundation concrete, scraps of painted sheet metal and wire, weeds that had gotten in where the sod was broken up for whatever little enterprise was attempted. None of that here, not kept up, just never messed up in the first place. It's just the way it always must have been, reservation land. So again, we begin to reflect on the importance of motorcycle maintenance, which obviously, is going to be a big theme of the book. But it's a theme of the book for a specific reason in this case coming up. And the narrator is confounded again at John being unable to engage with this practical necessity. There's no friendly motorcycle mechanic on the other side of these rocks, and I'm wondering if we're ready for this. If anything goes wrong now, we're in real trouble. And then he's talking about his own motorcycle. This old engine has a nickels and dimes sound to it, as if there were a lot of loose change flying around inside. Sounds awful, but it's just normal valve clatter. Once you get used to that sound and learn to expect it, you automatically hear any difference. If you don't hear any, that's good. I tried to get John interested in that sound once, but it was hopeless. All he heard was noise, and all he saw was the machine and me with greasy tools in my hands. Nothing else. That didn't work. He didn't really see what was going on, and he was not interested enough to find out. He isn't so interested in what things mean as what they are. That's quite important. And indeed, that is important, as we shall soon see. Then there's an amusing episode where where John's handlebars are slipping, and the narrator offers to shim them with a piece of beer can aluminum. And John is totally put off by this, even though it makes perfect sense on a practical level, on the level of form. But despite the practicality and the wonderful simplicity of the solution, John's not having it. He's living on the aesthetic level. As far as I know, those handlebars are still loose, and I believe now that he was actually offended at the time. He had the nerve to propose repair of his new $1,800 BMW. That was in 1968. The pride of half a century of German mechanical finesse with a piece of old beer can. Ach du lieber! For a while, I thought what I should have done was sneak over to the workbench, cut a shim from a beer can, remove the printing, and come back and tell him we were in luck. It was the last one I had, especially imported from Germany. That would have done it. A special shim from the private stock of Baron Alfred Krupp, who had to sell it at a great sacrifice. Then he would have gone gaga over it. That Krupp's private shim fantasy gratified me for a while, but then it wore off and I saw it was just being vindictive. And I do think this is a good point, especially since we're talking a little bit about differing points of view. It is so human to want to punish someone for having a different point of view. We're doing it all the time these days on social media. It's so irritating to face that barrier when we know 100% we are right, and to have that acceptance really ultimately is what maintains friendships and relationships. But it takes willpower and maturity. Dale Carnegie can help. Seriously. Putting some thought into getting inside someone else's skull is tough, but the narrator makes a real effort to do so, not only for the sake of his good friend, although that's a big part of it, but also for the sake of what he's beginning to figure out about the nature of reality. What emerged in vague form at first and then in sharper outline was the explanation that I had been seeing that shim as a kind of intellectual, rational, cerebral way in which the scientific properties of the metal were all that counted. John was going at it immediately and intuitively, grooving on it. I guess I forgot to mention that John's a musician, a drummer, who works with groups all over town and makes a pretty fair income from it. We were both looking at the same thing, seeing the same thing, talking about the same thing, thinking about the same thing, except he was looking, seeing, and talking from a completely different dimension. So the two dimensions are, in this section, he kind of identifies them as hip and square. And the hip and square distinction became extremely important at that time, but it actually reflects something, much deeper, much more eternal than that. It was important then, and it's important now, although we may use different terms. This temperamental difference is another way of delineating numerous barriers people have. So think about the Harris-Peterson debate on truth. Which version of truth is true? I propose that's a temperamental distinction. Scientific versus religious, dogma versus mysticism, right versus left. And in this book, art versus science, and on down the line. And it won't be a surprise to you or a spoiler to know that much of what we will be reading is going to be focusing on this distinction. He really does care about technology. It's just that in this other dimension, he gets all screwed up and he's really rebuffed by it. It just won't swing for him. He tries to swing it without any rational premeditation and botches it and botches it and botches it. And after so many botches, gives up and just kind of puts a blanket curse on the whole nuts and bolts thing. He will not or cannot believe there's anything in this world for which grooving is not the way to go. And there we have it, will not and cannot. And that's where we are if we don't have insight into the other's point of view. And to have that insight, we kind of have to get lucky. We kind of have to somehow understand that we kind of want to. Otherwise, you're stuck in a dimension and can't escape. And I propose that that's where we are as human beings a lot of the time. That's the dimension he's in, the groovy dimension. I'm being awfully square talking about all this mechanical stuff all the time. What you've got here really are two realities, one of immediate artistic appearance and one of underlying scientific explanation. And they don't match, and they don't fit, and they don't really have much of anything to do with one another. That's quite a situation. You might say there's a little problem here. So indeed, yes, there is a little problem here. So we're going to have to start figuring it out. I will see you next Sunday for part 2 of Chapter 5.